This tutorial is on my top tips for getting really nice, neat, beautiful gathers like these ones. I'm also going to tell you some things to avoid getting ugly or bad gathers like these ones. So I'm going to actually be gathering on this sample here. I've just gathered one flat strip onto a smaller strip, so one longer strip onto a shorter strip. However, a lot of the time when I'm gathering, I might actually be gathering something that's already closed up as a round. So for example, this is a bit of a dodgy piece because I was just using it as a sample of how to slash through fabric for some year sevens. So this piece has already got two pieces sewn together. So this might be, if you are doing a skirt, you might already have these pieces sewn together, or even a sleeve or something. If you're sewing a sleeve onto an armhole, you would have already sewn them together before we're gathering them. And I'm going to be sewing them onto a round. So I've got this piece here that I'm going to be sewing them onto. Now, this piece ideally would be half or even less than half the size of this one. So getting nice gathers, you can do double the thickness. You can do just a half again, so you could do to about there, but you're not going to get a huge amount of gather. You could actually do 3 times the length of the piece you're gathering it to get really nice tight gathers. I'm just going for about double the length. So that's my lengths of fabric. You'll see I do already have them seamed, so they're seamed on either side. And I have made sure I've already done my encasing so that they are not going to fray, those edges aren't going to fray. And now what I'm going to do is create 2 long lines of gather stitching. Now, if you were doing a really, really long strip, I often do advise that you just work in a few different lengths of gather stitches and you do them between your seams, so these seams here. Although you can actually gather over top of the seams, and because I'm not gathering a huge amount, I am going to gather over the seams. So I'm going to change my machine to a straight stitch. I'm going to put my length up as high as it can go. Now on this machine it only goes to 4. On some machines it might go higher than that. I'm going to put my width down to 0 because I'm a straight stitch and I shouldn't need any width. I'm going to start, I am actually going to start off the gathers because it will be easier to, off the seam, because it will be easier to not have the seam there where I start to pull the threads. And I'm going to put my first line of stitching, sorry, I'm getting a lot of glare on my camera today. I'm going to put my first line of stitching definitely closer to the edge than a seam allowance would be. So if I'm going to have a 5/8 seam allowance, I want my lines of stitching to be closer to the edge than that. So for my first line of stitching, I might even use this little groove of the presser foot as my guideline and try to keep it there the whole time. And then my next line of stitching will be maybe the edge of the presser foot against the fabric there. So I'm going to do 2 lines all the way around. And I'm not going to do a back stitch with these this time, so no back stitching. There's 1 line. Now I'm not going to back stitch that. I am just going to finish off that stitch, take it out. Now I made sure on this one, where possible, I didn't sew over the seam allowance. However, on the other seam that was there, I did sew over it. Now when I cut this off, don't cut your threads too close to here. You want to leave a little bit to pull. So cut them off around about here. Now I'm going to put my second line in. Now it's always important to put a second line in. Some people think it's just so that if one line of stitching breaks, or one of the threads break while you're pulling them, then you can just move to the other thread. That's, in sometimes if you're being lazy, yes, we might use it that way, but actually it's to give much neater gathers. So having 2 lines of stitching, when you'll see as I start to pull the gathers, it will allow me to gather them in a lot more evenly, whereas if I just have 1 line of stitching, it's not going to gather them in as nice and flat and even. So this line of stitching now I'm going to do still within the seam allowance area and trying to run parallel to this line here. Again, no back stitching. So again, I'm going to pull this out quite far, and I'm going to cut the threads off, leaving some threads for me to pull attached to the fabric. Now it's a great idea to get yourself comfortable, if you're doing something quite large, I would definitely recommend moving to a bigger table so you can have space to do this. You're going to now be very gently and carefully pulling on your bobbin threads. Now, to work out which are your bobbin threads, I actually used a different color, so I know that my bobbin threads are the pink threads. If you didn't do that, if you have the same color, which is fine, absolutely normal to use the same color bobbin as top thread, the way you can work it out is to say which threads did you, or which side of your fabric did you have on top when you were sewing. I know I had this one on top because I was being careful about moving around that seam allowance. So I know that these ones that were on top, they're my top threads, and these ones will be my bobbin threads. So grab your, you need to do a little bit of maneuvering here to grab just the bobbin threads and make sure you've got the ones going to the correct side. So I've got these two pieces here that are going to be pulling from this side, and then I've got these two ones here. Sometimes they get a little bit tangled with the top threads, so just make sure they're nice and untangled. They're the ones that I can pull to move this way. Now, once I've started pulling, don't pull on your top threads. Otherwise, you'll sort of lock that gather in where it is and you won't be able to keep gathering. Doesn't matter which way you start to gather from. If you want to just gather all from one side, that's fine if you're comfortable with that, or you can gather a bit from both. So as you gather, my tips to not break your threads are to not think so much about pulling on these as much as you think about moving the gathers along the fabric. So I've got gather here now. I'm going to move that gather along my fabric like this. Then I can give another gentle pull. And then I've got more gather here. I'm going to move that gather along the fabric. I also want to make sure I'm pulling both of them evenly. So I'm not pulling one of them more than I'm pulling the other. Try to pull them evenly. So move my gather along the fabric. So now I've gathered my fabric up. I've probably over gathered it. I can already tell from looking at the size of the piece that I'm about to join it to. I've gathered it too much. That's okay. As long as you don't go and either tie off or cut off these threads, keep them long. I know they can get a bit annoying, so especially if you're doing a really big piece, they will get very long. Sometimes I might, if they're extremely long, I might cut them at some, down halfway. But it's better not to cut them because you might actually need to pull out some of your gathers, and then you want to try and just keep your gathering even. So don't have areas where it's kind of flat and then areas where it's more bunched. You want to have an even amount of gathering or an even amount of bunching all the way around as much as you possibly can. We do sometimes adjust it a little bit while we're stitching it onto our next piece. So sometimes there's a little bit of space for tweaking it as you go, but try and make it even. Now I'm going to lay down my piece that I'm going to be gathering it onto, and I'm going to be checking the size, checking that they fit. So I can see straight away I've gathered it too much. So I'm going to be pulling some of these gathers out until it's the right size. Almost there. There we go. So that's fitting nicely now. So I'm going to try and keep those gathers. See, I've got an area where it's gone really flat. So I'm going to move my gathering around to that area a little bit to have an even gather. Now, this is the sort of gather you'll get when you're working to double gathering a strip that's double the length of the strip of the piece that you're going to be sewing them onto. If you want tighter, thicker gathers like the ones that you saw when I was first pulling in that fabric, you probably want to go to about 3 times the length of the piece, that the strip that is going to get gathered, as opposed to the piece that you're gathering it onto. So these are relatively even. I'm definitely going to tweak as I go a little bit. I'm ready now to attach it to here. Now we want to go right sides together. So I can find the right sides of this one are there. I'm going to put, obviously I want this, I'm going to pretend this is my top here. I'm going to put this one here. So when I say the top, that's where I'm joining them onto each other. I'm going to put the gathered one inside, and just because I like to join up my seam allowances, I'm going to join them first at that seam allowance point. This one should have been either overlocked or encased. You can forgive me for this little sample. I'm going to put the pins in going up and down this direction, and I'm going to sort of have them facing the way from the inside, because that's where I'm going to actually be sewing. So I'm going to line up my 2 seam allowances, make sure my seam allowances are open, and putting my pins in so that I'll see them from the inside, and they're going in an up and down way. Now what I've found here is I've actually pulled out my gathers a little bit too much. So I will just need to grab the threads from here and retighten them a little bit and ease them along. Okay, I'm ready to sew this now. I'm going to give you a few tips as we sew at the machine. Now make sure that you put your length back to 2.5, so we're not doing long stitching anymore. We're going to work from the inside here, so putting this part under our presser foot like this. Now we want to sew more into the fabric than our lines of gathering. So you should now be on a proper seam allowance line, because this is the seam that we are doing, for example, joining a skirt onto a bodice or joining a sleeve into an armhole. So we should be working with the correct seam allowance now. So you definitely be lower than your stitches. If you are higher than them, you will see them from the good side of your fabric, which is not very nice. Now, a couple of tips is that as I go, I want to go quite slowly, and I want to really focus on continuing to pull my gathers nice and flat and sort of in their correct alignment. Because as you'll see how this one over here is kind of pulling up this way. If I just sew over that, it could potentially pull up like that. Or this one over here might sort of pull up in a funny direction. This one's going to go too far over that way, I can already tell. So if I pull them a little bit downwards from here, that helps them kind of stay in their correct alignment, and it will gather them in so much neater. So I am back stitching now. So pull them down, pull them down. All right, so I've been really careful sewing that slowly. I'll be speeding it up for the video, so you would have watched it quite quickly. So let's have a look now at the good side and see how my gathers went. Pretty good. There's a couple of places there where I went a little bit. This is where I went, didn't sew below the line of gathering stitches, so you can see those gathering stitches. I could just go and pull those out. They're not needed anymore, so that's not the biggest deal in the world. I did it in a few places actually. But you can see all around the gathers are fairly neat and even. So that's my main tips for getting neat gathers. Make sure you do trim off any loose threads. Sometimes you get some threads sticking out. So trim all those off now. And if you want to, you can pull out the gathering stitches. As I mentioned, it's advisable to pull them out if they're showing from your good side, like there. So definitely unpick that and pull those ones out because they're not needed anymore. But you don't have to if they're not showing. You can definitely leave them in if they're not showing from the good side of your fabric. All right. Oh, what happened there? No, that's just the fabric screen a bit snagged and tugging out of place. All right, so there's my tips on gathering neatly. Hopefully that helps.